depressing week. Very depressing week.
Hmm.
I don't have anything to say other than that. Thanks for coming to the podcast. Not exactly the U.S.'s best moment here on a number of different levels. Um, yeah, we're pretty much gonna just talk about Afghanistan this week. Just because that's all we really have to have stuff to say about. But yeah, definitely just a systematic failure on a number of different levels.
Hmm.
Um, that I think we saw coming to some level, to some degree. I know John and I had both talked about how this was an event that the U.S. actions in the withdrawal definitely led up to what's happened over the past couple of weeks.
Hmm.
We saw it with the, announcement Biden made back in April about withdrawing troops by September 11th, which was a very arbitrary deadline. And then pulling out troops very, very quickly without leaving enough in country to. It wasn't as much a crisis of military failure as a crisis of confidence. Um, this was an event where and I think both of us had talked about this earlier, where without the US backing, a lot of Afghans just thought the best solution would be, let's just end this now, let's end it as quick as possible. um Afghans, a lot of Afghans wanted that US backed government, but they aren't stupid, and they're going to back the horse they think is going to win.
Hmm.
um which, we had talked about this, just a very quick withdrawal and would end in this. I mean, there wasn't really a debate on whether or not that was going to happen.
Yeah, and obviously with the US announcing its withdrawal, it was very much sort of the same picture from the rest of the coalition. They sort of realised that with the US moving out, there was going to be such a significant reduction in the number of coalition troops and therefore coalition air power as well, that a lot of nations just turned around and said, yeah, we can't continue this fight without the Americans, so we need to get ourselves out before we start losing people at a ridiculous rate.
Yeah, and I will say there were promises given by the U.S., of course, as we found out, to the U.K. and in general NATO allies, that security in Kabul would remain, and we would keep the situation there secure, so other countries could operate in Kabul at least. Um, and that was a massive lie.
Mm.
Um, and has definitely caused a crisis of confidence. I don't know, John, if you can speak to this a bit better about the current fallout, at least in the UK right now.
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot of reading. There's been a lot of articles by veterans of all ranks and all levels of experience in Afghanistan. We're talking people with one tour, we're talking people with 3 or 4 tours. And the general feeling is that with the way that the withdrawal has happened and the way that the Taliban has been allowed to take over Afghanistan so quickly, and just with the general political attitude towards it all, I think a lot of the veterans are very much feeling like their efforts, their sacrifices were in vain. And we've got to remember, this is a conflict that's been going on from our perspective for 20 years. Um, I think between the US and the UK, there's been something like 2,800 dead among our own troops just because of this fight, and it's very, very hard not to agree with the perspective that after the way this withdrawal has happened, all of those lives, those sacrifices may have been to no avail. Um,
Yeah, and I know a lot of political leaders and especially military leaders will, tell veterans that their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They, brought massive change to Afghanistan. But I mean, veterans aren't exactly that stupid. They can also look at the news and they see what's happening. And I mean, it really seems at this point like the objective truth is your sacrifice was in vain. The Taliban now have stronger control in Afghanistan than they did in 2001, before the U.S. and British, or actually coalition, led intervention. But it just, and this is what a lot of veterans are seeing, and this is, obviously something that's caused issues. I mean, I've talked to veterans who fought in Afghanistan during the first initial invasion, um, in that sort of, October and later period in 2001, and they look at it and they say the Taliban were in a much more tenuous situation in 2001 than they were today.
Mm.
They have much stronger regional control, apart from a small government resistance in the Panjshir Valley, which will probably devolve into very heavy fighting over the next few days. Um, there's really nothing. There is no North anymore. There's no Northern Alliance. There's no Northern Resistance because the U.S. went and effectively broke up those militias, um, and basically created this power vacuum in the North that the Taliban was able to very easily take advantage of. And you just have this situation now where they have solid control over the country, and that's caused a lot of depression and just angst for a lot of veterans who fought in that war, and there were a lot of people in the U.S. who fought in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
and a lot of people in the U.K. as well, and it's just this sort of what were we there for if it's worse off now.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that in the UK we really started seeing the situation in Afghanistan sort of hitting the mainstream news once we heard that locations like Kandahar were falling, and obviously the UK had quite a significant amount of history with Kandahar, it being one of several major bases that the UK operated out of during its time in Afghanistan. Um,
Yeah, I remember it was when former Camp Bastion had fallen.
mm,
I'm forgetting the what it had been renamed to under ANA control, but that was definitely a moment, that a lot of people looked at and sort of started to recognize the situation was going very south.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, again, a lot of us had sort of looked at that, and I mean, I was following it fairly closely. Even back when most of the sources of information out of Afghanistan were very pro-Taliban accounts, which means you had to sort through a lot of conflicting information on both sides, and that, I mean, you could see there were a lot of issues, with the Afghan government was claiming massive casualty figures on the Taliban side. I mean, I think
yeah,
if you add it all up over the past 2 years, the Afghan government had probably claimed that they killed over 100,000 Taliban fighters. Um, so you just have this situation where the media environment was very unreliable, but there was still this general attitude among Taliban fighters and among, ANA forces that once the U.S. is gone, we're done for.
mm.
And the cessation of U.S. air support, earlier in the summer, definitely, I, I
It
think
definitely had an
honestly,
impact.
yeah, I think I spent some time looking back today before the podcast at, like the turning point events that we were absolutely, sure that, like, if you could locate one event and change just that one decision, it would change, the outlook and the outcome of what's happening today. And I mean, the decision I had to look at was the decision to stop air support for the Afghan army.
Mm.
Um, that just caused, I mean, if we had kept supporting the Afghan army, um, through to now, the situation would be a lot more different. They
Yeah,
just they just collapsed.
yeah, and it's fair to say as well that without the US air support, the Afghan army's own sort of air support capabilities very much dwindled. I mean, we saw very, very quickly after the Taliban started to sort of move across the country that Afghan army air assets pretty much just either capitulated or began fleeing rather than trying to fight.
Yeah,
I know we've
because
had
they
a lot of stories of Afghan army aircraft trying to get into Uzbekistan and some of the other neighbouring countries.
Yeah, and it was additionally the Afghan Air Force. They I know Biden tried to claim that, oh, the Afghan Air Force, was built up and was strong and sort of just was useless at the end of the day. But I mean, they had 10 to 12 track aircraft at any one time that were
Mm,
usable. But the ground attack assets they had were more focused on um, liaising with on the ground forces. And the issue was the ground forces were not exactly trained, and they don't have tactical air controllers. They don't have people who are trained in coordinating with strike aircraft, and so the strike aircraft would hit the wrong targets, and they would they would just completely miss. And there was one case where in Kandahar they bombed the regional police station because of a mistake,
mm,
while the police station was occupied by Afghan National Police Forces. But on the other hand, U.S. forces were primarily built on identifying um, or locating, identifying, and then attacking, all from air assets, which didn't require much coordination with on the ground Afghan assets. So basically, after the U.S. had stopped striking Taliban targets, the capability, this air power capability against the Taliban, effectively evaporated. Um,
mm,
and so these were Afghan troops who had gone from, their job was basically go out, find the enemy, start contact with the enemy, and then the US will come in and bomb the enemy. And it turned into, you actually have to go out and face an ally who is, or face an enemy who is more motivated,
mm.
similarly or better equipped, and uh, you don't know where they are, and they will set up ambushes and they will go after you. And it's just a situation that it was impossible for them to keep up because, again, their force numbers were not great, their strength was not great. There was systematic corruption in the higher echelons of the army that were making unit strength 20% or less. And then there were defections because soldiers weren't getting paid, they weren't getting supplied correctly, and they would just leave. And the Taliban sort of came up with this new sort of plan of attack when the U.S. announced that they were pulling back. Of they wouldn't execute, or they wouldn't harm soldiers who defected or who just abandoned their posts. They would basically just take them, give them money, send them home. And so it's just, without that U.S. support, and I think this might have been underestimated, um, at least in the U.S. Foreign Service, was
Mm.
just there was no real motivation, or not motivation to fight, but there was just this overwhelming just defeatism once the US pulled back all support, because there was nothing to fight for.
Yeah. And it's worth saying as well, you made a really good point about the whole air support thing. It's something we've seen time and again in modern history, where when air support is not available, the opposing forces can just absolutely, ruffle stomp through. I mean, the example that springs to mind, it's not a perfect example, but France in 1939 and 1940, the biggest issue the French had was that ultimately their air support very quickly fell apart, and the Germans were able to push through on the ground pretty much unheeded. And we've kind of seen that again with the Taliban in Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks, where the US air power has evaporated, and suddenly the Taliban are coming out of their caves and wherever else and thinking, well, hang on a second, we don't have to worry about what's going on above us anymore. We can just deal with what's in front of us on the ground. And as you
Yeah,
say,
and one of the big things that where that actually ended up metastasizing was the fact that the Taliban could now move around in force.
mm,
They could gather a bunch of Taliban fighters together and go perform coordinated operations, where earlier, if you got more than a few Taliban vehicles together, that's a very juicy target for a JDAM.
yeah, exactly.
That's a great target for US air power. And they were able to move from this strict insurgency hit and run into, and transform that into an actual offensive. And that's again, that was just the huge change that happened. And I know, and I absolutely know that people in the military told people in the State Department and in the White House about that, um, because that was just the reality on the ground. And either it was underestimated or unheeded, or maybe they thought they had longer, but it was pretty clear once U.S. air power had stopped and once U.S. troops were out of the country that, the Afghan government was a dead man walking.
Yeah, and it wasn't even just the US strike capability that vanished, obviously. It perhaps even more importantly was the lack of a reconnaissance capability that left. Because as you said, that the Afghan military's air power was limited in scale, and ultimately, when the Taliban realised that A, there's no longer fast jets overhead, and B, that they're no longer being watched, like you say, they began to group in larger and larger numbers, and ultimately the Afghans couldn't see that happening. So they were
Yeah.
effectively fighting blind. And then when the big push eventually came a couple of weeks ago, they had no idea what they were facing,
Yeah.
and the Taliban had
Well,
been able to organise.
and the Taliban, they started this, they started the beginning stages of their big push far earlier in the summer. Um, and I know I was following this very closely. Natsec Jeff, great person, go follow him. He's been just doing amazing work, cataloging and giving people information on what's happening in Afghanistan. Um, but we had seen that the Afghan army very early in the summer had mounted a very, very effective offensive into Kandahar city, massive city, and it was just it was this warning to a lot of us that wow, the Taliban now has the ability to mount large scale offensives into very heavily populated and what should be heavily defended areas, and the Afghan government is putting up very, very little resistance. And just the end state of that, as I had also said, was I believe I said this on one of the earlier podcasts this summer, was the Taliban are not going to have to fight their way into Kabul. They're going to waltz their way in,
Mm.
because once you start losing, one or two major cities, the government's done for. Ghani is catching the next plane out of the country. It's, again, it's not that these are fair weather governors that control the outlying provinces, but they know they're not stupid. They know when, everything is done for. They know when the situation is over. And we saw that. They negotiated peace settlements with the Taliban.
Mm.
And it's because they knew what the outcome was. Without the US, they were sort of just like, what's the point? Are we going to keep fighting just to eventually lose, 1 or 2 years down the road, or do we just, give up now? And
Yeah,
and I think a lot of people in the Afghan army also understood that as well, and that's why we saw just such a rapid collapse.
yeah, and I think it's also part of the reason we saw such a rapid collapse was because a lot of Western countries just almost refused to believe what was unfolding in front of them to start with. Um, we obviously there was a few tweets that really caught my attention during the first few days where it was senior officials in the EU and also sort of diplomatic journalists, in various news outlets, turning around and saying, "Well, hang on a second, we're still negotiating with the Taliban, so this isn't going to end in tears."
We'll strongly tell them in Doha that they should stop doing this.
Yeah,
That was
effectively that, and I think it's fair to
they
say
were
that we
two
sort of
weeks ago.
yeah
2 weeks ago, they were still announcing, we're gonna tell them to stop doing this in Doha. Like, I
yeah it was a complete political unwillingness to accept that the Taliban might actually be trying to fight this one and that negotiations were not actually going to go anywhere. And it just blew my mind that you had these people genuinely suggesting that diplomatic talks would be continuing and that the Taliban would still be open to a diplomatic resolution while we're watching the Taliban literally charge across the country and take half of the country's capitals in the space of 2 or 3 days.
yeah,
And
that well, it
I
was
think I
it
think I said to
was
you and a few other people that the diplomats who genuinely believed at that moment in time that diplomacy was still going to be the result, and that the Taliban was still going to negotiate at the end of it, were completely just mad. Because once the Taliban realised that they were taking control of the country as quickly as they were, they had no need to negotiate anymore. They knew that they were going to
there was
win this fight.
there was zero motivation for the Taliban to negotiate starting April 24th of this year, when
Mm.
Biden announced that we would pull out by September 11th. There was zero reason for them to negotiate
Yeah.
because they knew they were going to win. There was no other end game for them, and so why would you make concessions? You're going to win anyway. So it's just this entire situation where there's a disconnect somewhere,
Mm.
and I think these will probably be classified and never released to the U.S. populace, even though it'll probably be very, very necessary to do some sort of public postmortem on this. I really do truly hope Congress decides to do some sort of actual postmortem on what happened. Where was the failure? And I don't care. Subpoena people, to ask people to testify, but figure out where the disconnect is so you don't do this again, because
Yeah.
everything about this withdrawal has just been just botched from
Mm.
step one, basically. And we can put blame on every US president who's been in Afghanistan. They each have their own individual faults, but even with Biden, even if he was handed a bad hand in Afghanistan with the Trump deal with the Taliban,
Yeah.
he did not have to. He took so many unforced errors,
Yeah.
and it was just you can't really explain those away other than he also wanted to be out of Afghanistan. So it's
Yeah. And I think it's interesting to note at this point as well that we've had obviously a story come out in the last few days that the US Chief of General Staff, General Milley, and the US Secretary of State for Defense, Lloyd Austin, both went to the president and said, please keep a minimum of 2,500 troops in Afghanistan because the country will fall apart if we don't. And Biden apparently turned round and chose to ignore their recommendations, ordered the complete withdrawal of all US forces, and then obviously we've seen the result, and ironically now there are more US forces in there than General Milley and Secretary Austin originally wanted to be in the country.
yeah. And this brings me back to an original point I was confused on, was one of Biden's, or at least one of the State Department's arguments of why they didn't evacuate people sooner, was that it would destroy Afghans' confidence in their government and it would destroy government confidence as well. But my sort of, and I don't think I've actually tweeted this out yet, but my confusion on this is, then why were you publishing how many troops you were pulling out and making it very clear that you were pulling out every, combat troop from the country,
Mm.
or combat personnel from the country? It really doesn't make sense how there was this. It must have been a disconnect somewhere, because the arguments don't make sense.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that the disconnect is still there, particularly at least in the US from what I'm seeing over here. The statements that have been coming from the White House, some of the speeches that I have watched in the last few days have left me absolutely bewildered as to exactly what the US government really believes is going on. I mean, they seem to be U-turning on themselves quite a bit as well. Of note, a couple of days ago, Biden was saying that the US military was fine, that they were going to be able to evacuate everyone they needed to by the 31st of August, and that they were perfectly capable of doing the job. And fair enough. But then today and yesterday in particular, we've had these announcements now that US airlines are being asked to provide aircraft to support the evacuation because the US military just doesn't have the capacity available, supposedly. And you have to kind
Third
of
time
wonder,
in
well,
history.
you know,
I believe the actual mechanics of that was it ends up being actually cheaper to invoke CRAF
Mm.
uh, 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 just invoke that because basically the leasing prices from airlines are just it's cheaper to get people home and frees up U.S. assets to transfer people from Afghanistan. But at the same time, like we shouldn't have needed to, activate that with only a few days warning. We shouldn't
Yeah.
have just the refusal of reality is the big thing about this. I talked to a former senior Democratic staffer about the situation, and it was just the thing that they mentioned to me was just the complete denial of the reality of the situation from the administration,
Mm.
saying things like Al Qaeda is no longer a threat in Afghanistan, which is just literally when Biden said that, my feed was literally full of every single defense person I follow, every single analyst I follow, every analyst who follows me, saying, "What are you talking about? That is very clearly
Yeah.
not a reflection of the reality on the ground and not something that we have seen at all." And it's just, it almost seems like the administration is trying to just present this alternate situation where everything is fine and, the Taliban aren't harassing us and people are getting out fine and it's easy to come to the airport. And then they, 2 days later, the State Department says, don't come to the airport. It's too dangerous. It's just,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
And
a
it feels
denial
like
of reality.
they're clutching at straws for a lot of it. I feel like, I mean, as you say, there was that particular example. Biden was, just a month ago was saying that there was absolutely no circumstance where you would see
Oh my
people
God, that
being
press conference.
evacuated
Oh my
from
God.
the U.S. embassy's roof by helicopter, and yet we now have what will, I do not doubt, be an infamous photo in the next 20 plus years. I'm sure it will appear in school textbooks and so on, of Chinooks and Sea Knight helicopters owned by the US hovering over the US embassy. Um,
Yeah, it's just, honestly, that press conference I think was so bad because, like, every single thing he said
Turned
was
out to be complete
wrong in like
nonsense. Yeah,
in proven wrong in like a month. Like not it didn't even take that long. And
yeah,
I think I think both of us had live tweeted that press conference with, just updates of what he was saying. And
mm,
like at the end of it, I just said, this is all going to be wrong. This is all wrong. It's and it's going to be proven wrong. Um I I will say my initial predictions for the speed of the collapse was probably back when I made when I made my prediction back in April.
mm,
I said that the timeline for the collapse of the Afghan government is sometime around September 11th. Um,
yeah,
and I stood by that for a while. I also threw around maybe an October date because I thought it might take a bit more time for them to collapse.
mm,
But as sort of time moved on and we got into that August timeline and those cities started falling quickly, and then, publications were starting to say 90 days and, maybe a few months. And
yeah.
by that time, I was like, yeah, it's happening before the US gets out. This is going to be a very bad situation. Um, and it was just,
I think it was during episode 9 back in June sometime. I think it was sort of mid June we were discussing it, and I think we both sort of at that point realised that the situation was not likely to last much beyond September 11th. Um, I think it's fair to say, certainly from my perspective, when things eventually started moving, they moved a bit faster than I was expecting. Um,
yeah.
but
But
there
once
was,
they got moving, it was fairly clear how
yeah,
quick they would move.
and I think it's
Um,
fair to say we both kind of knew pretty much from day one when they announced the whole 90-day figure. I think we both turned around and very, very publicly said, well, that's a load of rubbish. Um, and I think I know Tom, Sierra Alpha, pretty much gave it, what, 2 weeks, if that. I think he said,
yeah.
and he was prepared to bet money on it when I spoke to him, and you know, here we are, a few weeks later, and yeah, it
Yeah.
fell faster than we thought, but we were a hell of a lot
We
closer
weren't
with our
that far.
guess
We were
than the US intelligence services, supposedly.
Yeah, and that's the embarrassing thing is it fell a bit faster than we thought, but we were still far closer than
Mm.
what U.S. intelligence thought.
Yeah.
Um, which I think is definitely maybe an indictment because we're just a few idiots with Twitter.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it
and
literally got to a point where we were saying 72 hours and it'll all be over. And the US was still saying, oh no, there's at least 30
like three
days.
months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and that is something else that is probably going to need to be looked into quite heavily in the US once this situation has more or less run its course. How the US intelligence services, with all of their assets, with all of their gathering capabilities, somehow didn't see the fall coming as quickly as it did.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say if they'd turned around and said a week instead of 90 days, we probably would have not been quite so harsh on them. But they were still saying 90 days when we were turning around and saying to our followers, no, they've probably got about 72 hours at this point.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think one of the main reasons that we were still off with our predictions when we said, maybe October, September, that time period, um, back in April when we were saying that, everyone was calling us, alarmists, and everyone was calling the French alarmists when they started pulling their people out in May. Um, but I think one of the things we had fallen prey to the same thing that I think the UK fell prey to was, and the other NATO countries, was that promise that troops would be kept in Kabul in order to keep Kabul safe.
hmm,
Um, and I think we didn't understand really how gutted that infrastructure at Kabul was. I think we probably should have taken note. I think when Bagram when
yeah,
the pullout at Bagram happened, that's when we probably should have taken additional notes of, I don't think the U.S. is going to be propping up the regime at all.
no,
They're not going to be propping up the government. They're just going to be gone. Um, that was definitely an element of that we should have seen, and I think other countries should have also taken note at that point that the U.S. disappeared in the middle of the night. They literally up and left in the middle of the night without
yeah,
really telling anyone that they would be doing it, um,
and
which was just a sign of how complete the evacuation or the troop evacuation was. Because at the time we didn't bother. I mean, we were still arguing this summer about like where to house SIVs in third party countries.
hmm.
And like at that point in time, we should have been talking about how we get them to the airport from the other parts of Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it's the whole pullout of Bagram thing as well, being sort of in the middle of the night and without telling anyone. It's funny because someone brought to my attention an article by The Onion. For those of you who are not familiar with The Onion, it's a
Oh, that was me.
satirical,
Yeah, that was
yeah,
me.
it's a satirical news website. And 10 years ago, they gave an article about the US withdrawing from Afghanistan in the middle of the night without telling anyone. And you couldn't make it up. An incredible read because it literally reads the way this situation ended up happening.
And
The
10 years ago to the week they had posted that.
Yeah, the Afghan base commander had no idea the Americans were going to pull out. He woke up the next morning and found them gone. And
Yeah, it was like,
it's just there's a meme which has been doing the rounds. I shared this meme back in late June on my Twitter account, and I think it's fair to say I didn't appreciate at the time how accurate it was going to prove. We'll probably stick this on the YouTube version of this podcast so you can see it. But it's a clip from The Simpsons where the US effectively turns round to Afghanistan and says, yeah, after 20 years, it's so long, but I don't recall saying good luck. And that's very much how this situation feels. I cannot imagine how the Afghan army troops have been feeling in the last few weeks, seeing the US completely withdraw from all of the different bases around Afghanistan that the US was operating out of, and then suddenly all this news of the Taliban pushing in from all sides, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't look good for the US. And as I said on my own Twitter a few days ago, it does not bode well for the world's view of the US in other circumstances as well. Because ultimately, yeah, okay, we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. We've not defeated the Taliban. They've now grown back, and it doesn't look good. My hope is that we do not make the same mistake with Daesh or IS in Syria and Iraq. Admittedly, there we don't have as many troops on the ground, so that side of things is a little different. But I think the US needs to make sure that it learns here that you've got to stay until the job is completely done, even if that means you stay more than 20 years. Yes, okay, the politicians want to avoid forever wars, but at the end of the day, again, something I've emphasised, and I know a number of ex-British military commanders from Afghanistan have also pointed out, the fact that we have allowed the Taliban to survive, the fact that they have grown back as quickly as they have, and the fact that we're now effectively giving them some form of legitimacy in that they are being recognised now as the de facto government of Afghanistan, that is going to come back to bite us. They may not be as severe a terrorist threat to us at this moment in time, but give it a couple of years and Al-Qaeda will be back on its feet fully, and we're going to see problems coming out of Afghanistan again. And that was something that Biden said as well, which really stuck with me. He said that one of the reasons for the US withdrawal at this point is that the terrorist threat from Afghanistan has been eradicated.
And we have the over-the-horizon capability to counter it if it pops back up, which is just such a denial of the reality of any situation. Like,
Yeah.
you can't do that. It's the whole point of our counter-terror operations is that it's not an over-the-horizon presence, it's an on-the-ground presence. Look at West Africa, look at, having advisors in Indonesia. Take literally anywhere where we counter terrorism, we have boots on the ground.
Yeah.
That's just a reality of the situation. And John and I both, have a background and understanding of domestic security, and both of us are extremely concerned about practical threats coming out of Afghanistan in the future, as a home for potential security threats to Western nations, and that's something we do not want to see happen again.
Yeah.
Um, and
And
it's definitely just an issue that we expect to see.
yeah, and ultimately there's a concern there from both of us. I think it's fair to say that because of the way the withdrawals happened, because of the way that the Taliban has taken over again, there is a good chance that, give it 5-10 years, we're going to have to send troops back in there. And I think it's fair to say that that's every politician's worst nightmare at this moment in time, because no one wants to be in a position where they have to turn around and say, yes, we shouldn't have pulled out, we should have stayed where we were. Now, unfortunately, the way that politics works, the chances are that the people who've made the decisions in the last 6 to 12 months will not be the ones who have to then overrule those decisions in 10-15 years' time. But
Yeah, and
it's a
does
very real
Bill Clinton?
possibility that we will be going back to Afghanistan, and I don't think a lot of politicians understand that at this moment in time.
Well, they don't care. That's the thing. Did Bill Clinton get blamed for 9/11? No, no, of course, no one blamed Clinton for 9/11, and so there's this understanding that maybe as long as it happens far enough in the future, you won't be judged for it, um, or it won't affect you. But it's just, look, we aren't war hawks at all. We're not, cheerleading war,
No.
but we can also see the reality of a situation, and if there's another, if there's another set of terrorist attacks, like, God forbid, something like 9/11, um, but maybe something more similar to the 7/7 bombings as well, um, but it's this threat situation that we are concerned about, and that we would prefer not to see. And the whole point is we have a presence, a very low kinetic presence in West Africa that takes barely any casualties on a yearly basis and is very, very helpful in controlling the spread of Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, and these fundamentalist groups that would pose us harm.
Mm.
And it's also helping the civilian situation on the ground as well. These are groups that commit massive atrocities, and I know people will say, oh, the governments are better. No, the governments that are in place are better. There is a system of democracy that may be flawed, but it's certainly better than the alternatives on the ground. And we have this presence that no one's saying, oh, it's a forever war in West Africa or it's a forever war in East Africa.
Mm.
And of course it's not. It's a continuing long-term presence to protect U.S. not just U.S. interests in the region, but it's also for domestic security for both the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah.
The Europe has a migrant crisis right now because the US and I guess Europe as well sort of shirked their responsibility in, keeping stability in these regions because, people will say, well, oh, it doesn't concern us domestically. Yeah, it will end up concerning you domestically at some point because people can move. Like, people don't stay in their own countries for their entire lives.
Yeah.
And you just external threat, like it's not Team America world police, it's Team America preventing issues before it bites us in the butt again. And it's the world has become more interconnected. What global hegemony do you want? Do you want a US one? Do you want a Chinese one? Do you want a Russian one? Do you want to go back to a British one? It's just it's sort of a fact of life at this point that someone is going to have to deal with these issues before they come back and end up affecting you.
Yeah, and the political idea of avoiding forever wars, as they call them, it's kind of a dangerous concept because ultimately the war on terror, no one has declared that over. So far as I'm aware, no one has turned around and said, "Oh yeah, we've defeated terrorism. It's all over. That's the end of that war." And ultimately, the war on terror is going to be a forever war. Terrorism in all its various forms is not going anywhere. It's here to stay. And so it's ultimately a case of whether or not politicians are prepared to fight. And clearly, in the case of Afghanistan, it would appear that they're not prepared to fight. And that
That's the
doesn't
thing.
bode well
It's not even.
because, as I say, the situation in Syria and Iraq is still ongoing. I think it's fair to say that we've been hearing, claims that Daesh is almost defeated or has been defeated, coming from Syria and Iraq now for probably the better part of a year, but realistically they still exist, and so US and NATO forces are going to remain operating in Syria and Iraq for the foreseeable future because ultimately they aren't gone. And as much as they'd like us to believe that they've won that war, they need to be careful not to do the same thing in Syria and Iraq as they've done in Afghanistan. Declare victory, start withdrawing, and then suddenly find that their enemy is not as defeated as they thought they were.
And I think the arguments to end Op Shader have effectively been killed,
Hmm.
at least in Britain.
Yeah.
That will be continuing for a while. I feel like a lot of issues for European countries was that it was a lot harder for them to project power into Afghanistan just because of how the
Because of the
area works.
logistics
They
and
needed
stuff, yeah.
they needed the US support in logistics, which I think is going to make a lot of European countries take a second look at their logistics processing capabilities and, and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be relying on the US for a lot of this stuff because who knows if the US is just going to sort of leave us behind. Um, and I think second to that, a lot of them are going to look at being a bit more aggressive with externally combating terror,
Yeah.
and militant groups. And I think there's going to be a lot more support for that in the near future because it's just this feeling of abandonment. And I don't feel like a lot of European countries want to go through this again. Um, And so I feel like at least absolutely in the UK, absolutely in France,
Yeah.
honestly, like any attempts probably blew up about 5 years, 10 years progress diplomacy between the US and France
Yeah, I think it's fair to
um,
say France has
with
sort of had
this.
its own lessons learned separately from Afghanistan as well, because we've obviously seen France has been heavily involved in fighting terrorists in Mali for several years now, and they've kind of also had their own realization that their force out there is not really suited in its current format to the mission continuing. And rather than pulling out as the US has done, they've decided actually we're gonna restructure, and we are going to go back in and well, sorry, stay in and actually continue this fight. Um, and so I think France is probably the one nation who's been watching what's been going on in Afghanistan, and has been probably least surprised by the circumstances, but also has probably learnt the most from what they've seen, because ultimately those are lessons that they need to learn for their own dealings in Mali. Um,
Yeah, and to be honest, that was probably why they were the most on top of the Afghan situations, arguably more so than the US.
yeah,
Um, and I think, at this point I'm sort of prepared to pivot over to the real issue that I think we're very angry about, and that is the handling of the refugee situation.
yeah, yeah,
Um, which is just probably the most unacceptable part of this sort of entire debacle. I know I've harped on it a lot. The US sort of didn't bother trying to get people out until there
until
was no
days
concerted
after.
effort
Yeah,
until after the Taliban took the country, basically.
yeah.
Um,
I,
because I guess there was a concern in the State Department that it would reduce confidence in the Afghan government, but
yeah,
nothing like withdrawing your troops to do that as well. It's just like, even if you like, I know some people listening to this, maybe, you can argue against the presence in Afghanistan, you can argue against the war in Afghanistan, you can argue about everything in Afghanistan, military industrial complex, all that. The one thing that you cannot argue about is actually getting people out of Afghanistan. Like,
mm,
there is no argument to be had on that. You have to do that. You have to get your own people out. You have to get the people that worked for you out. And arguably the moral obligation is you have to get anyone who wants to be out of Afghanistan out. Look what happened in South Vietnam.
mm,
The US would take literally anyone that could, get out of the country after the war. And we're seeing this now, that the Taliban is an existential threat to journalists, to women, to women's rights activists, to any activist, frankly. And look at what Canada did. Canada took 20,000 people, and the number keeps going up over that.
mm.
And they prioritized at risk people. Um,
And it's
France
worth
worked
saying as
early on
well.
getting their
It's worth saying as well. Canada wasn't exactly a major military presence in Afghanistan. When you compare them to sort of the US, the UK, Australia, and Germany, and so on, Canada didn't really have as large a military presence. And so for them to turn around and actually say, no, we're going to take X number of evacuees, and I think it's notable as well. Like when I was, as many of you will be aware who follow me, I was putting together a list of the aircraft involved in the Kabul airlift for probably the first 5 or 6 days of that whole operation, and the one thing that stuck out to me was that the Canadian component of that airlift was probably the single like biggest aside from the US for at least the first 48, 72 hours. The Canadians were getting people out before the Brits and the Americans had sort of actually started sorting themselves out and getting themselves organised.
I mean, the reality of this situation is the Americans, as of today, the 22nd, the Americans really still aren't getting that many people out
Hmm.
because of the security situation at the airport. And that's another thing that we'll touch on even later. But
Yeah.
it's just this, other countries that are far smaller than the U.S. had far lower, footprint on the ground in Afghanistan are just taking so many more people. And it's just it's just shocking to see. It's just it's
Mm.
I don't really know any way to sort of put it in a correct sort of frame, but it's just the abandonment of people who worked for you, who worked in the
Yeah.
embassy, and who translators and people who are at threat, who have faced persecution before, who have faced retribution from the Taliban. The Taliban, and the other thing is, the Taliban have these records on hand now. They have biometric records. They have the ability now to figure out, find out, and then most likely execute these people.
Mm.
And the U.S., at least the establishment right now, is coming up to what, 9 days from now, the U.S. will most likely be out of Afghanistan, barring some miracle of a foreign policy change. But it's this refusal to accept refugees and just these arbitrary roadblocks that got put up over the last few months in order to make it nearly impossible. I think probably the best descriptor to the arbitrary roadblocks that have been put up was the Afghan forces who are still working at the airport, who are
Yeah.
now effectively stateless and just working for the U.S. right now, um, as soldiers in at Kabul. But the official U.S. State Department policy is after we pull out, they can apply for visas. Like it's just
Yeah.
it's mind blowing how just I don't know why this is. Is it ingrained roadblocks in the State Department to immigration? Is it just I cannot for the life of me figure out why we aren't getting these people out of the country.
Yeah. And there's another aspect to everything that's been going on, which is concerning as well. And I've briefly mentioned it on Twitter and also in discussion on the UK Defence Discord server. Um, Ultimately, the world has watched the US response to the Taliban's rush across the country. They've seen how slow the US has been to respond. They've seen how limited the US response has been. And ultimately, they've listened very, very closely to what the US State Department and President Biden have had to say. And it doesn't look good, particularly if you are, for example, Taiwan. Now we had, as some of you will be aware, there was a period during the Kabul airlift where Chinese media, particularly various figures at the Global Times, and one or two other sort of diplomats and media outlets from China, very publicly started making comments about US presence in Taiwan and making threats towards Taiwan. And while this is not unusual, the timing and the strength of some of the threats that were being made did kind of sort of catch my interest and catch my intrigue. And ultimately, at this moment in time, Taiwan has watched the US effectively betray the Afghan people in the face of the Taliban. And I can't help but feel like if I was in Taiwan right now, I'd probably be a little concerned that the US is just going to stand by and deny that there's anything wrong when suddenly China rocks up on my doorstep in the morning. Um, you know, it's obviously a huge issue there. As I've already mentioned, the US actions in Afghanistan don't look good for allies working alongside them in Syria and Iraq. Um, and it also doesn't look good just generally for the future of US foreign policy, because it's going to have betrayed a lot of trust from nations who potentially would have turned to the US for help were they, attacked or invaded, or were they struggling with terrorism and groups like the Taliban inside their own borders.
Oh, and even European nations, because the U.S. promised safety and security in Kabul,
Mm.
and other European nations, relied on that, and then just got, you know, terrible luck for you guys. Sorry, we're out. Have
Yeah,
have fun. Get your own people out. It's just this.
I mean, I
I
know
mean, the
that.
reality is the U.S. made promises to other nations.
Yeah,
and then went back on those promises, and now other nations have to scramble to handle it. And it's just it, it may not be a reality of, what would happen if China tried to invade Taiwan, but it's a threat. It is a practical threat that other nations have to sort of take into account now, because again, actions speak louder than words. These
Mm.
are actions. Actions don't frequently happen. And when your actions end up speaking very loudly like this, going into the future, even if the US says things to try to appease these countries, it's just look back at what happened in Kabul, and you'll see, of course, Chinese propaganda harping on that again after again, because
Yeah.
it is a free propaganda victory to them. This is the entire Kabul evacuation system has the entire situation has just been a complete unforced error.
Yeah.
It is a media or a propaganda victory for China,
Mm.
which just that isn't great. That is not great at all. Um, and
And
it's just
yeah.
it's a mess.
Yeah, and from a personal perspective, it's been quite reassuring to see large parts of US media turning around and holding the US administration to account for what's been going on. Um, I think it's fair to say that probably more so in the US than in the UK, there has been a lot of backlash against the politicians for the events that have unfolded in Kabul. Um, whether that has an effect on the way the US administration moves forward and how it deals with the fallout from this situation remains to be seen. But um, I know that there's another matter that has sort of shocked a great part of America, and I know quite a few people I've spoken to in the UK. Um, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried to contact President Biden when things started unravelling in Afghanistan, and spent 36 hours being ignored before finally getting a phone call back. And
No
again,
one's home.
that doesn't look good. But particularly on this side of the Atlantic, it really doesn't look good for the country with whom we always harp on about our special relationship with, for the leader of that country to be ignoring us when ultimately it's fair to say Britain is probably the second biggest stakeholder in the Afghan situation after the US itself.
And this isn't like a minor disagreement or anything, like a little regional, maybe a spat, and that there's some issue over trade or something. No, this is like a practical issue where there are real ramifications for citizens of the UK and the US on the ground.
Mm,
And the prime minister could not get an answer out of the US president
yeah,
in a situation that they had been promised security would be maintained, and that went out the window overnight. It's just it is a multi-level failure, and definitely, I mean, I know people will hate me if I say this, but it has sparked a crisis of confidence in the US by worldwide allies.
yeah,
We're seeing this fallout already happen in the UK. This will be an event that causes fallout into the future.
yeah. I don't really
I
know, to be
guess I guess
honest.
the last thing we should sort of talk about is the Afghan resistance.
Mm,
That's this is the only slightly bright part in the entire, but it's not even bright.
no.
It's just slightly less depressing in the sea of depressing that is this that has been the last 2 weeks. But um, the former son of the famous resistance fighter in the north, the leader of the Northern Alliance, Masood, who was killed on September 10th, 2001, by Taliban and Al Qaeda operatives. Um, but he has sort of coalesced how do I put this, a resistance group, or what is still, I guess, the government, he claims, in the Panjshir Valley, which is a very secure valley north of Kabul. It's very hard to get in or out, and it's very defensible. The Soviet Union tried a number of times to mount an offensive into the valley, but got beaten back badly every single time, taking heavy casualties. Um, there are claims that the Taliban is currently trying to mount an incursion into the Panjshir Valley and not doing well. Uh, because again, it's the Panjshir Valley. It's effectively a 40-kilometer long line of defensive formations. Um, so we'll see how that goes. But again, the it is the government of Afghanistan. It is these guys are now the sort of last freedom fighters, and they are getting zero international support. And that's just, I understand the U.S. doesn't want to provoke any sort of issues with the Taliban, but it's just this abdication of principles, I guess,
Yeah.
of just, the Taliban are now mounting an offensive, and the U.S. will not help our, I guess you could say, former allies, because they're definitely not our allies anymore.
Yeah. As much as as much as I'm sure they would love to have US support, um, they will be feeling betrayed, and that again, as we've said already, that doesn't bode well for the US in the future. Um, once upon a time, the US was supplying weapons to its ally in Afghanistan to face the threat from the Soviet Union, and sure enough, a few years down the line, that ally was no longer an ally. Um, Perhaps the US wants to avoid a repeat of that, but I think it's probably more a case of the US doesn't want to acknowledge that there is a resistance there at the moment, because if they acknowledge there is a resistance, they are going to face calls to support that resistance, and
Yeah,
that's a
and if they
political
support the
minefield they can't
resistance,
deal with.
yeah, because apparently now we're in negotiations with the Taliban,
Yeah,
and look, people will call me a war hawk, but there are some things that I feel that it's just an abdication of moral, not just moral authority, but just this understanding that, I know the line, we don't negotiate with terrorists, is campy and stupid, but these groups just spent 20 years attacking US forces, breaking the laws of war, like openly breaking every single, Geneva Convention principle,
yeah,
and just straight up 20 years committing war crimes against US forces, against, coalition forces, against the Afghan people, and they're now just sitting pretty in Kabul while the US attempts to evacuate people. It just it's this complete abdication, and it's sort of hard to balance.
yeah.
I guess it's very hard to accept that as the reality. And on that bright note, um, I think that's where we're going to leave it today. Um,
Yeah.
More will keep happening into the future. We're going to keep following that very closely. Um, hopefully the U.S. takes action, and the U.K. takes action, and other coalition allies take action to rescue former allies in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
That's really all I can say. Is hopefully that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, and hopefully next episode we may have some more positive news coming from Afghanistan. Although, admittedly, at this moment in time, it's hard to see what positives can come from the Taliban takeover.
Yeah, when 800 people on a plane is your positive news, then stuff has certainly gone south.
Yeah.
And with that note, thank you for listening to the Osint Bunker podcast in collaboration with the UK Defense Journal. I am Osinttechnical, and that is John, aka Defense Geek, and we will hopefully be able to get back to you in 2 weeks' time with some better news.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening. If you don't already follow us, be sure to find our podcast Twitter account at the Osint Bunker on Twitter. We've just surpassed 1,700 followers over there, so by all means go and give us a follow. And we will hopefully catch you guys in 2 weeks' time.